Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to Chicago Humanities Tapes, the audio extension and archive of the live Chicago Humanities Spring and Fall Festivals. Producing around 100 events, discussions, and performances each year, we've become a year-round asset for thousands of people in Chicagoland and beyond. At Chicago Humanities, we connect people to the ideas that shape and define us, and to the lifelong exploration of what it means to be and stay human. For more information on events and how to support Chicago Humanities by joining us as a member, visit chicagohumanities.org. On today's episode, Ron Chernow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Hamilton fame, discusses his newest work, a nuanced portrait of the father of American literature, Mark Twain. Chernow sheds light on the life of Twain, from his start as a brash journalist to his days as the most notable political pundit in the U.S. Here's Ron Chernow talking with Mark Bazer on June 3, 2025, at the First United Methodist Church at the Chicago Temple.
I feel like we're getting married. Just come.
You know, I have to tell you, Mark, before we start, that Mark Twain was considered it bad luck to lecture in a church. He said because people were afraid to laugh in a church. We're going to prove him wrong tonight.
He had a lot of things to say about the church, so we'll be respectful. First of all, congratulations, #1 in the bestseller.
Thank you.
Yep. So, yeah. So I want to overall go mostly chronologically through his life, but I want to start with something that you write at the end, which goes against our popular conception of Twain. And that is, he didn't start wearing the white suit until very, very late in life. And we have this idea of him as this avuncular guy in a white suit with aphorism after aphorism. And part of that is true, but there's so much more. So talk.
Yeah, he would occasionally earlier on wear the white suit, but it was in 1906, so this is 4 years before he dies. He was lobbying in Washington. He suddenly appears in this blazing white suit. And the reporters asked him what this was all about, and he said, it's the uniform of the American Association of Purity and Perfection, of which I'm the president and sole member. And then he went on to say that he was the only cleanly clothed person in a dirty world. Not only would he wear the white suit, but very often he would wear kind of raspberry-colored socks or lime-colored socks. So he was quite a sight to look at. He hated men's dark suits. He said that men's dark suits accumulated so much dirt that you could plant seeds in them and raise a crop.
Yeah, but a white suit. All right, we don't have to. But more broadly, there's this myth of Mark Twain, and for me at least, this book, I don't know if it completely explodes it. Many things about the myth are true, but it shares so much. And I want to just ask you about the impetus for wanting to do it beyond, as you said when we were backstage, that day after day you would laugh at what you read. But what was the impetus for wanting to tell the story, the real story?
Well, my fascination with Mark Twain, I should say, started back in 1974. I was 25 years old. I was a freelance magazine writer in Philadelphia. And I saw one night there were posters up that said, "Mark Twain tonight!" ! Hal Holbrook doing a one-man show of Mark Twain. And I went, and he stood up there in the white suit with the cigar and the mustache. And it was, 90 minutes of the most hilarious political witticisms. Ones that I still remember, he said, quoting Mark Twain, there's no distinctly Native American criminal class except the Congress. Or, he said, suppose you're an idiot and suppose you're a congressman, but I repeat myself. Anyway, these things kind of lodged in my head. Or he said, I say, and I say it with pride, that we have legislatures that fetch higher prices than any other in the world. And it was a wonderful, wonderful show. And Hal Holbrook, of course, interested so many people in Mark Twain. I think we all should feel indebted to him. But, there's an image of Mark Twain in the public imagination of this kind of charming, irreverent guy with the mischievous twinkle in his eye. And that was true. But I also became aware that that was not the whole story. about the man that under the surface, this will not shock you, but it had not really been explored. He was moody and temperamental and volatile and not an easy human being to be with.
He was in many ways exhausting, I think. I mean, but let's go back for a second to his childhood. We all know Hannibal, Missouri. Is Mark Twain, as a child, Tom Sawyer, or is Tom Sawyer who Mark Twain wanted to be as a child?
Well, Mark Twain always said that, Tom Sawyer was in fact the character based on his on his life. And Mark Twain, as a boy, indeed, by all accounts, was a very kind of mischievous, antic, devil-may-care character, perhaps not quite as outrageous as he portrayed himself in the book. Some people remembered him as sort of much more quiet and gentle. But I have to tell you the story. When he was born in the town, not in Hannibal, but he was born in the town of Florida, Missouri. So this is kind of way up in the northeast corner of the state. So they'd moved to this little town with a population of 100, and he said that when he was born, he increased the population by 1%. He said, there's nobody else who has a record of doing so much, not even Shakespeare. But then luckily, when he was 4, they moved to Hannibal, which was a sleepy, isolated town in a beautiful, remote rural area, except, and the house is still there. When you exit the door of the house and you look to the left, there's just a block or two away, the broad, shining, magnificent Mississippi, the waterway. And here was this sleepy town that once or twice a day would suddenly come to life. They would see a little puff of smoke in the distance. They would hear the steamboat whistle. The boat would pull up at the dock, again, just a block or two from his house. And the entire house would town would come alive. And off that boat would be everything from circus acts to minstrel shows to traveling salesmen. The whole world kind of tumbled off of that. So even though he's living in a very kind of, remote kind of backwater, the world, because the Mississippi is passing by, is bringing tremendous variety and interest into his life. And this is very much kind of accidental life, as you know from reading the book. All these unplanned things happen. And just almost coincidentally, he keeps finding himself in one spot after another, where an enormous number of colorful characters, cross his path.
Well, he becomes a steamboat pilot, and that is one of the most prestigious jobs at the time. And it's also, he calls it later, and I don't quite believe him, but he calls it the happiest time in his life. It's also the time when he meets these characters who start to, I don't know if it's teach him, but give him some of the stories that become the impetus for what he will become.
I think actually it was the happiest time of his life. He said later on, he said that was the darling existence. There's never been a period of my life that was happier than that. I've often wondered how his wife and 3 daughters reacted to reading that. But he always, it was interesting because he keeps revisiting in his mind his childhood. First in Tom Sawyer, which is a very kind of golden, sunlit portrait of this town. Then in Huck Finn, suddenly there's slavery, and it's a much darker view of the town. And then as the years go by and he becomes more bitter and more pessimistic, he says of Hannibal, he said, half the people were alive and half of them were dead. A stranger couldn't tell the difference. So he goes from sort of romanticizing Hannibal to seeing much darker. In fact, one of the most interesting things that he wrote, we were talking backstage of how much interesting unpublished material there is by Mark Twain. He wrote something called Villagers 1840 to 43. And what he did, there are little capsule summaries of 100 different people, including his own family, 100 different people whom he knew from Hannibal. He disguises them with their names, but otherwise it's clear who they are and kind of what happened to them. And in almost every case, it's kind of one horrifyingly tragic story after another. So he would say, she was the prettiest belle in town, and she married this handsome, charming guy. He turned out to be an alcoholic who beat her. Then he abandoned the family. Then she was in a carriage accident and broke her legs. And he kind of goes on like that. And but he was never able to deal, I think, with that kind of tragic material. When I think of, I don't know, what a Theodore Dreiser might have done with some of those.
He also had a very low view of humanity.
Yeah, and it becomes lower. In fact, towards the end of his life, he not only talks about the damn human race, he says that if I had invented humanity, I would go hide my head in a bag.
Why then, and part of it is technology changes, but why does he leave this, what he later views as an idyllic past? Why? And let me also tee it up by saying, in so many ways, he becomes both a representation and he depicts this America on the make. He goes west, he goes to the Sandwich Islands, now Hawaii, he goes to San Francisco before landing back in Hartford, where he will spend.
No, you pick up something very kind of essential to the story, because we tend to think of Mark Twain as the quintessential American, and indeed, you know, he's grows up right smack in the middle of the country. And in one of his notebook entries, he writes, "I am not an American, I am the American," which sounds like an arrogant thing to say, but there's some truth to it. He really was the quintessential American, both for good, but also to some extent for bad. I mean, he has characteristically American traits. We like to think of ourselves as kind of, you know, irreverent, of the high and mighty, of nobility and aristocracy. Has an instinctive sympathy with the underdog, you know, throughout his life. But he's also money mad, something that people kind of miss, because throughout his career, he's satirizing the plutocrats of his day. So people figure, well, Mark Twain was so shrewd, you know, he would never be like that. But that's exactly what he was like. I mean, he was as money mad as any of the characters that he satirized. You know, instead of it satirizing the other, as I got deeper into the book, it seemed more like a self-portrait.
And, well, he's also failing a lot in his business.
Failing, yeah. You know, he said at one point, I've often been the easy prey of the cheap adventurer, and boy, was he. Another time he said, I must speculate, such being my nature. And when I started the book and I, you know, read this, didn't realize just how deep this went. It was really a compulsive urge to speculate, because the speculation, we could go into what happened, you know, speculation finally lands him in bankruptcy and causes terrible havoc in his personal life and his family life. But even after that, he can't stop and continues to engage in one speculative venture after another. And he never wanted to, you know, simply make a modest return on an investment. He wanted to invest in things that would make him one of the richest people in the world. In the same way that he had a florid imagination as a novelist, he had a very florid imagination for the potential of different things that he invested in, but almost no imagination for what would happen if the business did not succeed. His imagination was impoverished, and
which happened over and over
and over. Yeah, you know, and well, there were kind of two things that happened simultaneously. One was he was living in Hartford. Okay, let me just step back a second, because he not only ended up making a fortune from his book royalties and also his lecture fees, but he marries an heiress, Libby Langdon, from upstate New York, and they end up living in a 25-room mansion in Hartford, Connecticut. It has 11,500 square feet of space, a loyal staff of 6 servants. They're living a very beautiful and idyllic life. They have these 3 gorgeous, very smart and talented daughters. It could have been an easy life, but he gets caught up in 2 business ventures. First, he starts his own publishing company. Throughout his career, he always felt whoever was his editor, his publisher, Twain was convinced was a moron who was bilking. You know, he's always imagined that the publisher is stealing from him.
Is that true as a writer?
No. In fact, you know, at one point, he actually hired a lawyer to do an audit. And the lawyer, unfortunately, had to go back to Mark Twain and said that the publisher was actually honest, you know, and had paid what he had promised. It's interesting because he starts this publishing house called Charles Webster and Company. And the first 2 books that they publish, one is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The other is the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's memoirs in particular, Huck Finn sold very well, but Grant's memoirs are probably the best-selling book of the 19th century, aside from Uncle Tom's Cabin. But then he makes one mistake after another. And he also, even though he's from the South, he signs up not only Grant, But William Tecumseh Sherman and Phil Sheridan, it seems like he has every Union general, even after his deputy warns him that the market is saturated. But one thing that would be interesting and topical is one of his publishing errors was that he signs up the authorized biography of the Pope. And it was, guess what, Pope Leo the 13th. We now have Leo the 14th. And Twain, again, with his vivid imagination, is certain that every Catholic in the world is going to rush out and buy the authorized biography of the Pope. Even the Pope himself was very skeptical. The Pope had a better sense of the marketplace than Mark Twain did. The book did not sell well, and only a small fraction of Catholics rushed out to buy it. So he made all sorts of mistakes with the publishing company, which ran up tremendous debt. But a much bigger problem is that he had started out, his father died when he was 11. He becomes a printer's devil in his older brother's newspaper. So he kind of feels like he knows something about the newspaper business. And he meets a man named James W. Page, who has invented a machine, a compositor machine, a typesetting machine that can replace 5 or 6 printers. And Mark Twain is convinced that this machine will revolutionize the newspaper business. So you can see in his notebooks, he has long columns of figures. He's calculating the number of newspapers in the world because he feels that every newspaper in the world will be forced to either rent or buy the Page typesetter. Now, at the beginning, this goes on over a 14-year period. At the beginning, Mark Twain is in love with James W. Page. He said that he was a great poet. He was the Shakespeare of mechanical invention. He said that Page was so persuasive that he could have coaxed a fish to come out of the water and take a walk with him. But then what happens is this is a very complicated machine. It has 16,000 moving parts. And they were not alone in the field. And there was another machine that was perhaps not as exquisitely ingenious as the Page machine, but it was more dependable. It was made by a man named Ottmar Mergenthaler. And of course, what the newspapers were looking for was not the most ingenious machine. They were looking for a machine that would run safely, reliably, day in and day out. So it's really Mergenthaler ends up dominating the industry. And Twain has invested in this. In contemporary dollars, it would come to at least $6 million. And a lot of that, probably 2/3 of that, was his wife's inheritance. They lost every penny of it, on this machine. And, Twain, who had started out by calling Page the Shakespeare of mechanical invention, ends up by saying, James W. Page was drowning. I would throw him an anvil.
Well, I want to go back to his wife, and there's something that you write earlier. You quote, I believe it's an editor back when he's out west, which is that he says of Twain that Twain is a sad, lonely soul, and he moves to Hartford, and he's 31 when he gets married, and he courts, and this is one of the funniest unintentional stories in the book, not from Twain's own words. He courts Livy, and she's younger.
She's about 10 years younger.
Yeah, and he falls in love, and her father, who is wealthy, asks for references. And what happens?
Yeah. Okay. So they're from Elmira, New York, and they were a wonderful, wonderful family. Very, very rich. The father, Jervis Langdon, had made a fortune in coal, timber, and railroads. He actually sold all the coal that fired the Vanderbilt's New York Central locomotive. So he made this vast fortune. But they were also a very philanthropic family. They were very active abolitionists. He had harbored Frederick Douglass from racist mob at one point, and Wendell Phillips. They knew all of the major abolitionists. And this begins to change Twain's attitudes on this whole topic. But anyway, Livy, when she was a teenager, was very, very frail, almost a semi-invalid when she was an adolescent, and now she's in her early 20s. She still is rather physically fragile, and she's an heiress. So they were naturally, for two reasons, very, very protective of this young woman. And so Jervis Langdon asked Mark Twain, who had been a reporter out in Nevada and out in San Francisco, asked him to get 10 letters of reference from his friends out west. And so Twain contacts them, and the 10 letters come into Jervis Langdon, who then sits down and tells Twain that all 10 of the letters describe him as wild and lecherous, idle and drunken. And he says to Jervis Langdon, says to Mark Twain, "Don't you have a friend in the world?" And Mark Twain, kind of crestfallen, says, "I guess not." And then, miraculously, Jervis Langdon says, "I'll be your friend. I know you better than they do. Take the girl," you know. And this was kind of an amazing act of foresight, because you could imagine Mark Twain blew into their lives like a tornado. He had been on a cruise aboard a ship called the Quaker City with Libby's brother Charlie. Had seen a picture of her. It's a little ivory miniature. And he said from the moment that he saw the picture of her, she looks very kind of sweet and pure and beautiful. He said, she was never out of my mind again. And she's reluctant because Mark Twain was this very overwhelming, can you imagine, overwhelming presence in her life. She'd had a very, very sheltered life. So Mark Twain woos her with the main weapon at his disposal, words. So he sends her 200 long, passionate letters. There were so many letters, she began to number them, probably wondering when this would end. You know, so it's like over a 2-year period that, you know, he woos her, which is why when Mr. Langdon said, "I feel I know you better than the letter," he probably did. And actually, sadly, after they got married, you know, he died about 6 months later, but it was a very, very happy marriage.
Yeah, that's what's incredible. Twain, and it happens over and over again in the book. We don't have time to get into everything. He will meet somebody. He will be like Page. He'll be best friends with the person.
Yeah.
And eventually he hates the person. And he says the best things and then he says the worst things. But Livy, throughout her life, because she dies well before he does, is his rock. And also does to in some degree tame some of his wilder impulses.
No, he chose better than he knew, because even though she was physically frail, she was extremely intelligent and, you know, very strong personality inside. Just in terms of the love match, I mean, we have so much correspondence between the two of them. There's hardly a letter from Livy to her husband that doesn't end with, "I adore you, I idolize you, I worship you." And his letters are exactly the same. She would also, because he was constantly out lecturing, you know, she would often write to him, "Life is so much more interesting when you're around." You know, even when he was difficult, there was never a dull day with Mark Twain. But what happened, by Mark Twain's, you know, own admission, he said, "When I met Livy, I was a mighty coarse, rough, unpromising, you know, character." And here she's grown up. She's exquisitely refined, a tremendous sense of tact. She's been brought up in very kind of aristocratic surroundings. And she makes him palatable to polite society. He really didn't know how to do that. She trains him in what I think today we would call anger management. So he had a tendency, you know, he would fly off the handle and he would sit down and he would very impetuously write an angry letter to someone. And she trained him, when he did that, to stash the letter in the drawer and wait a few days to reply. There were also kind of a lot of letters out at the Mark Twain archives in Berkeley, because they had a very active social life, and very often you could see the morning after a dinner party, he would write to someone, "The madam tells me I may have been a little brusque and sharp with you last night, and if so, I want to apologize." You know, he didn't realize he was so funny, he was so satirical, didn't always realize how easily he could hurt people, because there's a very kind of sharp edge to his wit. And then what happened, they developed a system of color-coded cards for dinner parties. If she held up a red card to him, it meant, "Are you going to monopolize that woman to your right the entire evening?" A blue card meant, "Are you going to sit there and not say anything all evening?" You know, so you could see her kind of get, you know, training him in polite society. He didn't quite know how to do that. He had so much energy very often during dinners. He would get up and pace back and forth, sometimes talking a blue streak. I mean, he had this real kind of mood swings. He was probably somewhere on the spectrum, but he would go from tremendous bursts of energy and talkativeness, and then could be sort of very, quiet and lethargic. The three daughters loved watching Livy train father, and they called it mother dusting father off. And even Mark Twain said, Livy edited my books, and then she ended up by editing me. And it was not too far from the truth.
You mentioned that the family that Livy comes from were abolitionists or worked with abolitionists. You also, a theme that comes up again and again in the book, I think, is that he was a Southerner who became a Northerner in many ways. And I think this is a good way to kind of tee up some of his most important writings.
Yeah.
And that's obviously like Huck Finn, where he starts going back to his childhood. There's a lot. He's not just the humorist, which he felt kind of insecure about.
Yeah.
And I want to ask the question of how did his views on race evolve throughout his life?
Yeah, this is kind of a big part of the book. Okay, so he's born in Missouri. He's born into a slave-owning family in a slave-owning state. And when you read his adolescent correspondence, you get a lot of very sort of crude racist jibes. This probably would be typical of anyone growing up in that town. I mean, he told a lot of stories about his childhood. One of them was that a man, a slave owner, hit his enslaved man with a piece of iron ore. And for doing something awkwardly, it was not a big offense. And the man dropped to the ground, and an hour later, he was dead. And Mark Twain said, no one in the town was happy about this behavior, but no one objected openly to it, And he said that in his upbringing, the righteous, the sacred people in town all agreed that slavery was not only moral, but the peculiar pet of the deities. That was the atmosphere that he grew up in. And then over the course of his life, he goes from that, kind of crude, rather racist teenager to, I think, the most tolerant and broad-minded white author of the late 19th century. I mean, what other white author would have said that American liberty dated not from 1776, but to 1865, when slavery was abolished? Or he said mockingly, Declaration of Independence should have said that all white men were created equal. And he even goes so far. There are kind of a lot of things that he ended up doing with and for the black community. In many ways, the most interesting was that he lectured, this is around the time that Huck Finn was published, he lectured at Yale Law School, and he met a very, very brilliant young student named Warner T. McGuinn. And he found out that Warner T. McGuinn, who was the head of the debating side, he was obviously one of the smartest students there, but they were making him live with the college carpenter, and he was doing these odd jobs to pay his way. So Mark Twain afterwards wrote a letter to the dean of the Yale Law School and said that he would like to pay for Warner McGuinn's education. And he writes to the dean, he said, we have ground the manhood out of them, meaning the blacks. We've ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it. And his closest literary friend, the novelist William Dean Howells, said that Twain felt personally responsible as a white man for what the white race had done to the black race, and he felt that he should make reparations. He actually used that word, should make reparations for it. Now, there's an interesting story, because that Warner T. McGuinn, that was a good investment by Twain, because Warner T. McGuinn became a lawyer. He argued a very famous desegregation case in Baltimore. And in Baltimore, there was a young lawyer in an adjoining office who was, I'm blanking on his name, first black Supreme Court Justice.
Marshall.
Huh?
Thurgood Marshall.
Thurgood Marshall, yeah, I'm sorry. Thurgood Marshall, who of course ends up arguing Brown versus Board of Ed and becoming the first, black justice. So there's like a direct line from Mark Twain's helping Warner T. McGuinn, through Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall later said that Warner T. McGuinn was one of the most brilliant lawyers he'd ever met, and had he not been black, would definitely have ended up a judge. Yeah. Great story.
At the same time, he is he is of his time. Huck Finn, I read it recently in preparation for this, and on the one hand, as you point out, I mean, it is a clearly anti-slavery, anti-racism book. It's also, as you note in the book, it's responding to, at the time, which is after the Civil War, in the 1880s, that there's this idea of lost cause apology, which is saying that, well, actually, the Northern agitators, slaves were happy, Northern agitators came along and they forced the issue in a way that slaves didn't want, which of course is crazy. And Mark Twain makes clear in the book that that's not true. At the same time, the whole last part of the book in Huck Finn is the Tom Sawyer character almost having, like, well, not just almost, he's having fun. He's making a game out of freeing Jim.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because, you know, Ernest Hemingway, who said that all modern American literature begins with a little book called Huck Finn, Hemingway suggested that readers skip the final part, and I have sympathy with that. It's kind of like he suddenly reverts to the kind of, pardon the poem, tomfoolery, you know, of Tom Sawyer again, which ends up not only demeaning Jim, but ends up demeaning the book. But what precedes it is extraordinary. And you're absolutely right that one could say, well, big deal, so an anti-slavery book after the Civil War, so what? But there was this whole lost cause school of Southern historians who were saying that actually the slaves were very happy, you know, during the slavery period. It was just Northern abolitionists who were stirring them up, and that Southern culture, Southern white culture, was very genteel and aristocratic. So that mystique was very powerful in taking hold, you know, in the South. And, you know, there have been kind of two controversies with Huck Finn. One is the N-word, which is used 200 times in the book, which, to state the obvious, Twain is using not to endorse racism, but to expose the pervasive nature of racism, not only in Huck's mind, but that of the other people that he deals with. And then the other controversy has dealt with the portrait of Jim. And Jim, on the one hand, is far and away the most noble and dignified and sensitive character in the book, almost the only one would say that. Virtually all of the whites in Huck Finn are violent and crude and profane. And so Twain, who by this point has moved to Hartford, and as William Dean Howells said, Mark Twain was the most de-Southernized Southerner he had ever met. So Twain is clearly taking a very, very critical look at the Southern white community. And he doesn't go back to visit. Very seldom does he go back to visit. But the portrait of Jim, this goes back now probably 75 years. Portrait of Jim was criticized by black critics, but not exclusively, who said that even though Jim is this very, very sympathetic character in the book, that there were certain minstrel affectations that were grafted onto that character. And two in particular, Jim is very superstitious. It was kind of part of the caricature of blacks at the time, and very credulous at the time. And I think, you know, so that was one of the things that I think spurred Percival Everett to write his book, James, which I think is not meant as a debunking book of Mark Twain, but more as a corrective of Mark Twain. You know, and what he has said in interviews is that Mark Twain, as a white man, you know, in the 19th century, was really kind of not equipped to give the fully realized version of Jim that he was with Huck. In fact, he gave a very nice answer. He was asked in one interview that I heard, he was asked, what do you say to people who say that Huck Finn should be banned from the schools? And he replied, I say they've never read the book.
You've, I'm sure, surely been asked this. I know you're a historian, not somebody who's making conjectures, but do you think, what would Twain have said about James?
I really don't know what he would have said about James, for the simple reason that Mark Twain was not generous in commenting on other authors generally. He actually, interestingly enough, said that he seldom read novels. He at one point said, I only read novels when all the neighbors are reading a certain book and I feel I have to have an opinion about it. But the list of famous writers he disliked is very long. He hated Jane Austen. He hated George Eliot. Interestingly enough, his wife and daughters were constantly reading Jane Austen and George Eliot, you know. So take that, father. Also, by an extraordinary coincidence, the first date, we can use that term, the first date that Twain ever went on with Livy, they went to Steinway Hall in Manhattan to see Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was doing his last lecture tour in America. So here's Mark Twain, really at the start of his career, the great American author, and here's the great British author, kind of towards the very end of his life. And you would think that Mark Twain would like Dickens. No, he didn't find him that funny. He also he criticized his lecture style. He also found the pathos false. He said the pathos was in the language, not really in the feeling. He said the pathos was like this, glittering frostwork. It was not quite real. So, I'd be afraid to say what he would think of Percival Edwards' book. I would be afraid what he would say about my book,
Well, that's interesting because you get into this in the book. He did not like biographers. He did not want a biography written. Eventually one was. It was mostly the guy became a kind of a hagiographer. Maybe he would have liked that he would have been like, well, the guy wrote Hamilton.
Yeah, Mark Twain famously said that biography is but the clothes and buttons of the man. The man himself cannot be written. If that's true, you needn't buy or read my book. You can just pass on it.
Much more than that.
But he did, because he was constantly badgered by different people who wanted to write his biography. So what happened, again, about 3 or 4 years before he died, he hired a man named Albert Bigelow Paine, who was a big fan of Mark Twain's, to do an authorized biography. And the authorized biography kind of had 2 parts. Like every morning, Twain would sit up in bed and he would reminisce, about his life. And then in the afternoon, Albert Bigelow Paine would start going through the thousands of contemporaneous letters from 20, 30, 40 years before. And, Mark Twain once said that he only remembered what hadn't happened, not what had happened. But, Paine would interview him in the morning and then would go find a letter in the afternoon that directly contradicted a story that Mark Twain had told. Mark Twain would sort of look at him mystified, like he could not figure this out. And Twain often said that only the dead could tell the truth. Twain felt that life makes cowards and liars of all of us. So what he decided to do was that and there were 226 of these sessions. It came to 450,000 words. He decided that the autobiography of Mark Twain would be published 100 years after his death. And actually, University of California Press, starting in 2010, he died in 1910. Starting in 2010, they published the first of 3 jumbo volumes, about 1,500 pages of Mark Twain reminiscing, and it's hilarious and fascinating to go through it. But as a biographer, I could tell you one has to read it with a certain care. You can't take a lot of things literally that he said. And this says authorized biographer Albert Bigelow Paine said, what Mark Twain said about his past often had only a kind of atmospheric resemblance to what had actually happened.
Paine moved in with Twain. I mean,
Paine moved in.
That's not something that a biographer should probably do.
No, I mean, Paine lost all objectivity, and he really turned into, not just during Mark Twain's lifetime, but then after, really turned into kind of the protector of Mark Twain's reputation, which is not a healthy situation for a biographer to be in.
How do you, and I want to get back to his narrative, but how do you as a biographer, especially with somebody like Twain, who embellished so much, going back to the early days writing for newspapers where there wasn't this demand for truth-telling all the time, like how do you separate the fact from the fiction?
Well, we're lucky because we have really abundant resources to study Mark Twain now. Starting about 50, 60 years ago at the University of California, Berkeley, they started this Mark Twain Papers project. And so a lot of the stuff, so they're producing annotated scholarly versions, not even all the books, but they're taking all of the letters, putting it online, annotating it. So give you some sense of the volume of material here. They have 12,000 letters written by Mark Twain and his immediate family. They have 19,000 letters written to them.
Have you read them all?
I think probably all of his letters. Yeah. And he wrote long letters too. Also, people know Tom and Huck and Life on the Mississippi. He published 24 books. Most people don't know that he wrote a novel about Joan of Arc.
Who he was infatuated with.
They don't know that he wrote a book about Shakespeare, actually arguing that it was not Shakespeare who wrote all those plays, but Francis Bacon. He wrote a polemical screed against Mary Baker Eddy, on and on. So he was constantly writing and publishing different things. So there was an enormous amount just of his writing to go through. Probably published somewhere between 1,000, 2,000 magazine articles. We have 600 unfinished, unpublished manuscripts, left behind 50 notebooks, very kind of thick diary-like notebooks. And so I felt that I was able to study him in fine-grained detail. So very often in those dictations, he would tell some funny story. So I would kind of put it in as a funny story just because it was such a good story and kind of, revealing of his mind. But as I was actually kind of trying to reconstruct those earlier periods in his life, far and away the preference was for the actual contemporary letters that he wrote. And luckily he wrote a lot of them.
Will you ever read Mark Twain again? I think you've done your time.
Well, I was saying backstage, one of the problems I had during this book, and I think it counts in large part for the length of the book, I was not only reading, all of the published stuff, but I was reading a lot of unpublished stuff from Mark Twain. And I would either come across something in the unpublished stuff that was so hilarious, or even sometimes in the published stuff, but something that is not read anymore, that I thought to myself, if I put it in the book, it becomes part of the Mark Twain lore and legend forever. If I don't put it in, it'll just be lost. I'll just give you one example. And in the last weeks of his life, he wrote something called Etiquette for the Afterlife. His mind was on mortality. And Etiquette for the Afterlife, it's advice when you find yourself in front of the pearly gates with St. Peter. And he says in the advice for the afterlife, don't speak to St. Peter first. It's not your place. Let him speak to you first. He said, there's no harm in asking Peter for his autograph, but just don't tell him that that's one of the penalties of greatness. And then he says, leave the dog outside. He said, heaven goes by favor. If heaven went by merit, you would stay out and the dog would go in. But this is too great to leave out. And there were kind of a lot of things like that I hope will become part of sort of the ongoing Mark Twain lore that people will repeat and relish.
For as adventuresome as his life is, for as funny as his writing, it goes without saying that there's so much of the book, especially in the latter, I don't know, maybe the last quarter, which is sad, right? He ends up he spends, I think, what did you say backstage, 11 years of his life in Europe. So the quintessential American writer actually spends a lot of time overseas. And a big part of that reason is his business failings, and he can get it. But another big part is that his two of his daughters in particular, and Livy, just have these health problems that are ongoing. And he's also, for somebody as cynical as he is, he's also very credulous about certain cure-alls and everything.
Also it had, because Livy's kind of spoiler, she develops congestive heart failure. The eldest daughter has meningitis. The youngest daughter is epileptic, So it really affects his religious views. It's very hard, that he would ask, if God is the Father, why is God doing this to his children? So it makes him very bitter. It makes him very pessimistic. He says late in his life that anyone who's not a pessimist is a fool. It really kind of colors his outlook. And as you realize, I was talking earlier about seeing Hal Holbrook. Another thing in terms of my obsession with the Mark Twain character, this was, I think, in the 1990s. Ken Burns did a very, very good documentary series on Mark Twain. It was 4 hours, 2 hours each night. And the first 2 hours, it was kind of the familiar Mark Twain. It was Huck and Tom and Life on the Mississippi, and had kind of a jovial tone. I was smiling the whole time. The second night was about all of the personal calamities that he had experienced. And that I really did not know about. And I just thought, as a biographer, that combination of literary triumph and personal calamity, of light and shadow, makes for really an ideal story of someone you're going to sort of wrestle with this as you read through the book. You're going to love him a lot of times. But as you pointed out earlier, he had a tendency, he could not let things drop. He would fall in love with people. And then if and when they disillusioned him, his vengeance was endless. And again, it was something that I could not completely figure out about him, because I think, we all have the experience of being angry with someone, and then usually, we'll blow up at them. We'll kind of get it off our chest, and then, walk away from it or put it aside. He would have wounds that would not heal, and would sort of go on for weeks, months, years. And that I couldn't really figure out. Because, when that happens with someone, and I think Livy tried to help him with this, when that happens, the person who ends up suffering is the person who's just kind of carrying around this anger and bitterness. And he did not seem to know, for whatever reason, how to get that out of his system.
You mentioned that there's these two aspects of him, or to his life. There's the personal, and then there's the literary triumph. I'd argue maybe there's a third, and you get into it a lot, and that's his celebrity, which becomes a global celebrity.
Yeah.
He also seems to just encounter some of the great people of his time. I mean, he runs in these circles. Helen Keller becomes a friend. Frederick Douglass is somebody in his orbit. Freud. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on. And he's
playing George Bernard Shaw. Goes on and on, yeah.
But I mean, is he? I don't know if he's the first, but is he one of the first American celebrities?
He loves celebrity. Even when he was in his autobiographical dictations, he said, "There's nothing that a boy loves more than celebrity." He said, "A boy would be a clown. A boy would be a pirate. A boy would sell himself to Satan himself, in order to attract the attention and envy of other boys." He said that about himself as a boy, but in a way that also defined, a lot of his life. He just loved attention. He knew that he loved attention, and he knew how to. So it was kind of the time of the rise of mass media, of newspaper chains, for the Hearst chains, the Pulitzer papers. Suddenly there were reporters who were constantly hungry for quotes. Mark Twain knew how to feed them quotes. He also knew, beyond the white suit, he knew all sorts of ways to impress his personality on the public. So, for instance, he would very often do interviews sitting up in bed in his nightshirt, and he'd be smoking a pipe, or he'd be smoking a cigar. He was an absolute kind of master of that. But he had, this is such a different story, I don't know, from writing about Henry James or Edith Wharton or someone like that. No, this was a writer who was shameless about his own self-promotion. So he would not only lend his name and his face to product promotions, he would write the ad copy. So one of the advertisers was the Word Fountain Pen Company. And he wrote this very kind of clever ad for them. It had his picture, and it said, "With one word pen, I have supported my family for years. With 2 word pens, I could have grown rich." What other writer would have done that? Another writer would have considered that sort of crass or unseemly in some way. But he was like the original influencer. It's kind of interesting to speculate if he were alive today, he would be the master of all of these platforms, in media that we have now. He would be reveling in.
Or you mentioned that he had to be talked out of sending a letter. Can you imagine just pressing the email button to
Yeah, Livy would not be able to control them.
What do you think this might be an impossible question, but what do you think his greatest talent was?
His greatest talent, well, I think the greatest talent certainly is with Huck Finn, because I think Huck Finn is clearly his masterpiece, and I think that he, created a a homegrown literature from the heartland.
Using the voice of people that were not accepted in literature before.
Yeah, these are just kind of ordinary people even like Huck at the bottom of society, who suddenly were given a voice and given a dignity and even a celebrity by Mark Twain. And at the time, the models for kind of Eastern Seaboard elite literature, omniscient narrator and of a novel and sort of some wise, all-seeing person. Whereas, with Huck Finn, he did something that had never been done before. The book is not only narrated by Huck, but what we see and hear is what Huck sees and hears. It's not what Mark Twain is seeing or hearing, or at least that's the illusion that he manages to create. He said a couple of things that are interesting about his preferred audience. He said, I never I never pursued the cultivated classes. He said, those folks can go to the theater and opera. He said, I always went after the masses. And another time he said that fine literature is like wine. He said, my writing is like water, but everyone drinks water.
I mentioned this earlier, he was insecure about being a mere humorist, but there's also a moment when he defended very eloquently the role of the humorist.
Yeah, at the beginning of his career, he's a humorist. He almost kind of falls into it as a journalist. He writes to his family that it's kind of a low-grade sort of writing, being a humorist. But he really kind of elevates being a humorist, and he also becomes, humorist doesn't begin to capture him. He becomes more of a moralist and more of a sage than that. But he also comes to feel over the years that humor plays a very, very vital role in our society, in our politics. He said, irreverence is the champion of liberty and its surest defense. He said, humor laughs 1,000 shams and falsehoods and superstitions into oblivion. I like the fact, he was going to form a member of the press. He was always a great defender of the press. One of my favorite Mark Twain quotes is, he said, the devil's aversion to holy water is a light matter compared to a despot's dread of a newspaper that laughs.
While we wait for some of the questions to pour in, it was mentioned in the introduction, I got to ask about Twain in Chicago, and there were two moments that I can remember in the book. One is when he is actually proud to be next to or honored alongside of Grant, and the other, and we'll do that first, and the other is he kind of is here for the World's Fair.
Yeah, but he's sick. And
he gets sick. He doesn't go.
Yeah, it's actually kind of had to do with the page compositor. But the story with Grant in 1879, Grant was honored by the Army of the Tennessee. It was this huge reunion of Northern soldiers, and Mark Twain is invited. And there's a speech at a theater that kind of goes on into the early hours of the morning, and Grant is being honored in one speech after another, and then Mark Twain gets up. I won't kind of give you the whole thing. He decides he's going to give a toast to the babies, and how when Grant was a baby, and he tried to stick his big toe in his mouth, he said, "If the child was father of the man we know, he succeeded." Anyway, they found it very funny at the time, and. Ulysses S. Grant, who had been sitting there like a statue, immobile the entire evening, completely cracked up. And then the soldiers all start singing, marching through Georgia. And like at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, he writes this letter to Livy. This was the greatest night of my life. I cracked up Grant. And then afterwards, William Tecumseh Sherman and Phil Sheridan and John Logan and all these people come up to congratulate him, and he's talking about how moving it was that they were all singing Marching Through Georgia. Now, this was a man not only from the South, but he had fought for 2 weeks in the pro-Confederate militia.
Yeah.
And so he's like adopted this identity. And then also, as mentioned earlier, in his publishing house, he was publishing only Union generals. He never published a single Confederate general.
Fascinating. All right, let's go to these questions. I like this one. Outside of Mark Twain's most well-known writings, What is a lesser known or underrated title that you would recommend?
Well, kind of one of my great favorites, his first book was called The Innocents Abroad. So what happened was it was kind of an early tourist cruise to Europe, and particularly the Holy Land. And Twain managed to swing an assignment as journalist to be on board that ship. And at the time, Americans had fawned over European culture, but not Mark Twain. So that they were going to a lot of museums, and he really began to hate the old masters. He said the old masters are all dead, and I only wish they had died sooner. And he had absolutely no taste in terms of art. So they go to the Sistine Chapel, and he describes it as Michelangelo's nightmare, full of repulsive monstrosities. Those poor cardinals who just met there in the conclave. Then they go to Milan, and he goes to see Da Vinci's The Last Supper. And he said there were a dozen painters painting copies of it before the original. He said, I couldn't help but notice how superior the copies were to the original. It goes on like that. He also notices that in each country they go to, he gets tired of seeing paintings of all these saints. And he says, why is it that in Madrid the saints all look Spanish, and in Ireland they all look Irish, and it's kind of having
a fair question.
Great fun with it. And then finally, and because I should say the people on this cruise, most of them were quite devout, so it was a big thing for them to be in the Holy Land, and they go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now at that time, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was thought to contain the tomb of Adam. And so Twain describes being in the church, because it's an extraordinarily sacred spot, and he sees the tomb of Adam, and he said, thank God I saw the tomb of a relative. I saw Adam's tomb. And he describes how he dropped to his knees, and wept. And he had these Adam jokes throughout his life. In fact, he said that he always envied Adam because he said when Adam told a joke, he knew that nobody had told the joke before him.
That does.
But it's a great book. It's one of those books where you could feel a young writer. It became his first book, and actually his biggest selling book. He sold 100,000 copies of The Innocents Abroad, and for the rest of his life, he tried to publish something that would match the sales of that, and he couldn't. But this kind of a wonderful sense often happens with the first or second, book of a writer, where you just kind of feel the writer glorying for the first time in his power. So I would heavily recommend it. But again, Mark Twain, one thing to emphasize, we couldn't have a Mark Twain today because we have an atmosphere of political correctness, and so for Mark Twain in his day, he could get away with things that he could not get away. So, his comments on the on the French, he said, it's a Frenchman's home is with another man's wife, or he would say, it's a wise Frenchman who knows who his own father is. So he would say all these things. He would have so many enemies now. People would jump on him, for it. But just everything in that time was fair game.
I do think you can still make fun of the French, but here's two questions. I'm going to try to combine them because they're similar. It's about your writing process. How do you handle all the content? Obviously, there was so much here. Keep track of everything. Take us through the process. Is there an outline? Are you at a certain point just like, what am I gonna do with my desk is full of stuff?
Yeah, well, my methods are very low tech, almost prehistoric. I record all the information on 4x6 index cards. I write on screen, but then I print them out in the form of 4x6 index cards. Usually, by the time I sit down to write, I have about 25,000 cards. And this, again, very old-fashioned. I put them in old-fashioned index card boxes with the tops open. I have little tabs. Remember tabs? I have tabs to identify different episodes and people and themes. And I actually kind of see the whole book taking shape with the index card. So I never actually have an outline of the book, but I can actually see it with my little tabs, and I guess I have it in my head. And always, I'll say this at an event like this, and someone will write me an email afterwards, Mr. Chernow, there's a software, available now that can do that more easily. But this is my 8th book. I'm not going to change my methods at this point. If it ain't broke,
This is a great question because that's very important, I think, to his life and to how he ended up viewing women. Could you talk about a little bit about the influence that his mom, Twain's mom, had on him?
Oh yeah, I'm glad, because she was a wonderful, wonderful guy. His father was very cold and distant. He said his relationship with his father, who died when Twain was 11, amounted to a state of armed neutrality. The father was a very kind of cold and distant character. Humorous, yeah. I say in the book the father who found humor in nothing spawned a son who found humor in everything. And maybe that's not coincidental. But the mother, Jane Lambton Clemens, who has almost a comical resemblance to Mark Twain, she had the same slow drawl, the same kind of dry wit, the same plain-spoken eloquence. Just one story that I can give you that will give you a flavor of Jane Clemens. Twain was born prematurely, so he was like this very sickly runt. And when Mark Twain discussed this with Jane Clemens later in life, he said to his mother, "Yeah, you must have been worried about me all the time." She said, "Oh yeah, I was always worried." And then he said to her, "Afraid I wouldn't survive?" And this perfect deadpan. She said to him, "No, afraid you would." And it's interesting because it's such a Mark Twain kind of line, even the kind of the pause, the timing of it. So he obviously got all of his not only wit, but emotional sustenance from his mother. She loved to dance. She apparently so loved different spectacles. She loved the funeral as much as the circus or a parade. She was just a very lively character. And he said, she had a nature of pure gold. I think it was his first book he dedicated to her. And he wrote, my dearest and truest friend.
And I think you had a line also that he, maybe because of his mom, he trusted women in a way that he might not have.
Trusted women, yeah, that he was able to open up with women in a way. He did not have a lot of very close male friends. He was somebody, he was like, everyone wanted to have him as the toastmaster for their banquet. He knew hundreds, thousands of different people, but they were acquaintances. He was very close with the novelist William Dean Howells. The Hartford minister, Joe Twitchell, was a very close friend. And there were various writers whom he met. He and Rudyard Kipling, it's sort of interesting, they had this sort of mutual adoration society, even though their politics were completely opposed, because Twain became a foe of imperialism and Rudyard Kipling was kind of the great supporter of it. But he doesn't have a lot of close friends, and I think really it's with his wife and to an extent with his daughters that he opens up.
Very Chicago-centric question, but we're in the city of improv and Second City is here. How do you feel that Twain's brand of humor went on to shape the landscape of comedy, not just in Chicago, but across the U.S.?
That's a very good question. I was lucky enough last week I did an hour-long podcast with Conan O'Brien, and it was very interesting because it was to be able to have a conversation with a professional comedian and to get his view of it. And I was kind of asking him a similar question. And again, it's something I think only a professional comedian would have picked up on. Because we all remember the Mark Twain quotes. These Mark Twain quotes are kind of burned into our minds. What he pointed out was that Twain mastered succinctness. And that humor had been rather kind of slow and long-winded. In fact, you could see, because at a certain point, the last 20 years of his life, he began to manufacture these Mark Twain aphorisms, and he would work on them in his notebook, and very often he would rewrite them maybe 5 or 10 times until he got exactly the right wording. So I think that Conan O'Brien is onto something. Late in Twain's life, someone sent him an anthology of American humorists. And there were about 40 or 50 humorists who were in the book. And what he noticed was that he was still the only one who was known. The others had faded. And humor tends to be very topical. It's based on circumstance. I mean, we turn on, the comedians at night, and they're making a joke based on what's happened, politically during the week. So the humor tends to fade very fast. The remarkable thing about Mark Twain is how few of his jokes require any kind of topical explanation. They're kind of universal lines that still apply without someone saying, well, you had to know what was happening in 1884. And that's really a great gift. So he must have been aware of that to kind of trim away topical references and to say things that express some universal truth.
But politics also weren't, we started with that a little bit, but politics weren't completely his love to talk about, I don't think.
Well, he started, when he was young, he was completely uninterested in politics. And then he did, 1876, he campaigned for Rutherford B. Hayes. 1880, he campaigned for James Garfield. But then what happened in 1884 was a very important moment in his life. He had become a Republican. They were the Liberal Party of the time. And the Republicans nominated a man named James Blaine as their nominee. Blaine had been a Speaker of the House and had been criticized in the Republican press for years for being a crooked speaker. And Mark Twain said that he was shocked that not only all his Republican friends, but all of these Republican newspapers that for years had been running exposés of James G. Blaine suddenly whitewashed him. So he became what was known as a mugwump. And what the mugwumps were, these were people who said, I'm not going to automatically vote for a particular party. I'm going to vote for people based on the content of their character. And so he never again, he felt that party was a trap. In fact, we complain about hyperpartisanship now. He complained about it then. One of his funniest lines, he said that the partisanship had become so bad that if the Democratic Party included the multiplication table in their electoral platform, the Republicans would vote it down at the next election.
And we get that today.
Yeah.
What did the story you told in the book on Grant of Twain assisting Grant in publishing his memoirs inspire you to get interested in Twain, select him as your next subject?
Yeah, those you've read the Grant book know that I both start and end with the figure of Mark Twain. So in a way, I had head start. There were various things that I learned about their relationship, which was just so beautiful, that I wish I had known at the time. That Mark Twain said that Grant had the purest nature, the purest character of anyone he'd ever met. He said that Grant was the greatest person that he had ever personally gotten to know. And then the line again that I wish I had in the Grant book, that because he watched, Grant was not only writing his memoirs for Mark Twain's publishing firm, but Mark Twain was watching him, die of cancer of the throat and tongue. And when Grant died, Twain wrote to Livy, he said, manifestly, dying is nothing to a really great and brave man, which I thought was just the most beautiful eulogy that one could give to someone.
Well, let's end it here. We had a question, which is just, do you have a favorite Mark Twain quote? I know you've read everything, but is there, pick one or two.
Two that I love. One because it's thought-provoking, the other is kind of funny. The one that's thought-provoking, Mark Twain once said that the two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you figure out why. That'll keep you up thinking tonight. And then the other one, which is just fun, he said, good friends, good books, and a sleepy conscience, that is the ideal life.
Well, on that note, Ron Chernow, everyone.
Thank you.